Ever heard the phrase auction fever? It's that moment when rational thinking disappears and you're absolutely convinced you need to outbid everyone else for something you don't want, don't need, and probably can't even use. Welcome to the world of auction disasters where people spent thousands on absolute garbage. 1. Someone bought a storage unit for $3,000 that was advertised as full of antiques and opened it to find nothing but 500 broken ceramic garden gnomes. The auction house had shown photos of the unit packed completely full of items. The buyer saw packed full and antiques and assumed they'd hit the jackpot. After winning the bid and cutting the lock, they discovered every single item was a broken garden gnome. Missing heads, arms completely snapped off, bodies shattered into pieces. The previous owner had apparently been a gnome collector who stored broken ones planning to repair them eventually, but never did. Professional appraisers looked at the collection and valued the entire lot at maybe $50 as scrap ceramic material. The buyer had to spend another $500 hiring people to haul away hundreds of pounds of broken gnomes. The dump charged disposal fees to accept the ceramic waste. Total loss exceeded $3,500 for broken garden decorations that belonged in the trash. The buyer desperately tried selling them online as craft supplies for mosaic projects, but nobody wanted broken gnomes. The gnomes sat in their garage for 2 years, destroying the space and their marriage. Their spouse genuinely threatened divorce over the gnome nightmare. Eventually, they paid another $400 hauling fee just to get rid of them permanently. Friends never let them forget the time they spent $3,000 on a storage unit full of broken trash. The auction house refused any refund because technically the listing was accurate. It showed a unit full of gnomes. They just failed to mention every single one was destroyed. The stupidity was bidding thousands without inspecting what you're buying, assuming full of antiques meant valuable items instead of broken garbage, and spending over $4,000 total to buy and dispose of 500 broken garden gnomes. 2. A bidder paid $5,000 for a vintage car that turned out to be a rusted shell with no engine, transmission, wheels, or interior parts. The auction listing showed exactly one blurry photo of something car-shaped covered with a tarp sitting in a barn. The description said, 1967 classic car, needs work, sold as is, no returns. The buyer saw 1967 classic and convinced themselves this was a valuable muscle car. They bid aggressively against 2 other bidders, driving the price up to $5,000 for a car they'd never actually seen. When the tow truck arrived to pick it up, they discovered it wasn't a car. It was the rusted outer shell of a car. No engine, no transmission, no seats, no dashboard, no wheels. Just the external body, rusted through in multiple places, sitting on concrete blocks. A mechanic looked at it and said restoring it would cost minimum $40,000 because they'd need to replace literally everything. The year and model weren't even desirable. It was a base model economy car from 1967 that nobody collected. Similar shells in better condition sold online for $200, $300. The buyer had paid $5,000 for $200 worth of scrap metal. They tried selling it and got offers around $150. They eventually sold it for scrap metal at $180 after paying $300 in storage fees for the months it sat in their driveway. Their HOA fined them repeatedly for the eyesore. Neighbors complained constantly. Total loss was over $5,500 when including towing, storage, and HOA fines. The auction house pointed to sold as is and needs work as legal protection. The stupidity was paying $5,000 for a blurry photo of a tarp, bidding on a car you never inspected, assuming vintage meant valuable and losing thousands on a pile of rust. 3. Someone won a bidding war at $2,500 for a box of rare coins that turned out to be 10,000 foreign coins worth approximately $30 total. The auction description mentioned large collection of international coins, potentially valuable with photos showing boxes full of coins. 2 bidders got into an intense bidding war, each convinced they'd found a treasure. The winner paid $2,500 and received 3 large boxes filled with coins from around the world. They excitedly took them to coin dealers for appraisal. Dealers explained these were common circulation coins from various countries with no collector value. The rare international coins were literally just pocket change from different countries, pennies, nickels, the equivalent of quarters from places like Canada, Mexico, and Europe. A few dealers offered to buy the entire collection for face value converted to dollars, about $30 total. The buyer had paid $2,500 for what amounted to $30 in foreign pocket change. They tried selling them online as a collection. Nobody wanted them. They offered them to schools for geography lessons. Schools said they had enough coins. They sat in the buyer's basement for years. Eventually, they donated them to charity for a tax write-off, claiming their purchase price value. The IRS audited them and reduced the write-off to actual value of $30. They faced penalties for inflating charitable donations. The other bidder, who lost at $2,400, sent them a thank you note for winning. The Stupidity was having a bidding war over common coins, paying $2,500 for $30 worth of foreign pocket change, and getting audited trying to write off your stupid purchase. 4. A buyer paid $4,000 for a professional photography equipment lot that was 50 disposable cameras from the 1990s. The auction house listed large lot of cameras, professional use, with photos showing multiple boxes labeled with photography brand names. The buyer owned a photography business and thought they were getting a deal on professional equipment. They won the lot at $4,000 after bidding against other photographers. Upon opening the boxes, they found nothing but disposable cameras, the kind tourists bought at theme parks in the 1990s. 50 cameras, all disposable, most with film still inside that was decades expired. The cameras were functionally worthless. The film was degraded. The cameras were designed to be thrown away after one use, and nobody had used disposable cameras in years. The buyer tried developing the ancient film, hoping for valuable vintage photos. The photos were vacation pictures of strangers from 25 years ago. They contacted the auction house claiming misrepresentation. The auction house showed the listing never said professional quality, only professional use. Disposable cameras were used by professionals in the 90s for quick documentation. The buyer tried selling the cameras online as vintage or retro. Nobody wanted them. They listed them for $5 each, no buyers. They eventually gave them away free, and still nobody claimed them. They'd spent $4,000 on cameras that cost $8 each when new, and were now completely worthless. The entire photography community mocked them for falling for it. The Stupidity was bidding $4,000 without confirming what cameras were included, assuming professional use meant professional quality, and owning 50 disposable cameras from 1990 that nobody wants. 5. Someone bought a computer lot for $3,000 expecting modern equipment, but received 30 computers from 1995 that didn't even turn on. The auction advertised business computer lot, 30 units from office closure, with photos of stacked computer towers. The buyer ran a tech business and thought they could resell the computers or use them for parts. They bid $3,000 and won. When delivery arrived, they opened the boxes to find computers from 1995, beige towers, CRT monitors, dial-up modems, Windows 95 operating systems. None of the computers would power on. The components were so outdated they were incompatible with anything modern. Recycling centers charged fees to accept the old electronics because they contained hazardous materials. E-waste disposal cost them $600. They'd paid $3,000 for computers worth negative value because disposal cost money. They tried donating them to schools. Schools said the computers were too old to use. They listed them free online. Nobody claimed them. They tried extracting components to sell. The components were worthless. A recycling facility eventually took them for free after the buyer begged. Total loss was $3,600 for outdated garbage electronics. The auction house said office closure didn't specify which year the office closed. The Stupidity was buying computers without checking the models or years, paying $3,000 for 1995 technology in 2020, and paying extra to dispose of your worthless purchase. 6. A bidder won a furniture lot for $6,000 that was revealed to be 20 pieces of damaged, broken, water-damaged furniture from a flood. The auction listing showed estate furniture lot, 20 pieces, various styles, with photos of furniture covered in moving blankets. The buyer owned an antique shop and assumed they were getting valuable estate pieces. They aggressively bid to $6,000. When the furniture arrived, every piece was destroyed by water damage. The wood was warped, swollen, covered in mold. Upholstery was mildewed and rotting. The smell was overwhelming. A furniture restoration expert said nothing could be saved. The water damage was too severe. The furniture needed to be disposed of as contaminated waste. Disposal cost $800 because of the mold. The buyer's warehouse where they'd stored the furniture temporarily developed a mold problem. Mold remediation cost $5,000. Their insurance didn't cover it because they'd knowingly brought in moldy furniture. Total loss was nearly $12,000 when including disposal and mold cleanup. They sued the auction house. The auction house's defense was the photos showed furniture covered in moving blankets. They never claimed the furniture was in good condition. The case was dismissed. The buyer lost everything. The stupidity was buying furniture sight unseen, bidding $6,000 without inspecting condition, and creating a $12,000 disaster by bringing moldy furniture into your warehouse. 7. Someone paid $7,500 for a vintage arcade game collection that turned out to be 5 broken arcade cabinets with no working parts. The auction advertised classic arcade games from closed arcade 5 machines, showing photos of arcade cabinets in a warehouse. The buyer collected vintage games and bid enthusiastically. After winning, they discovered all 5 machines were completely gutted. No circuit boards, no monitors, no controls, no coin mechanisms. They were empty wooden cabinets. The previous arcade owner had sold all the valuable internal components separately and auctioned off the empty shells. Restoration would require buying all new parts at approximately $3,000 per machine minimum. The empty cabinets were worth maybe $100 each. They'd paid $7,500 for $500 worth of empty boxes. They tried selling them to other collectors. Everyone laughed at the price. They listed them for $200 each. No buyers after months. Storage fees for the large cabinets cost $200 monthly. After 6 months of storage, they'd spent another $100 to $200. They finally sold all 5 for $300 total. Total loss exceeded $8,400. The auction house said the listing showed arcade cabinets, never promised they were functional. The stupidity was paying $7,500 without verifying the machines worked, assuming arcade cabinets automatically have their guts inside, and losing over $8,000 on empty wooden boxes. 8. A buyer spent $4,500 on a jewelry lot that was entirely costume jewelry worth about $50 from discount stores. The auction listing said large jewelry collection, over 200 pieces, various styles, with glamorous photos of jewelry displayed in cases. The buyer owned a jewelry store and thought they'd found a wholesale deal. After winning the bid, they examined the jewelry closely and realized every single piece was cheap costume jewelry from discount retailers. Plastic gems, plated metal that was already tarnishing, designs identical to items that sold for $5 or $10 at department stores. A jewelry appraiser laughed and valued the entire lot at approximately $50 retail. The buyer had paid $4,500 for jewelry they could have bought new at a discount store for $50. They tried selling it in their store. Customers immediately recognized the cheap quality. Nothing sold even at massive discounts. They tried selling it as a lot online. Offers maxed out at $20. They eventually donated it, claiming a $4,500 tax deduction. The IRS rejected the deduction after requiring appraisal showing actual value of $50. They faced penalties for fraudulent deduction claims. The auction house said jewelry collection never specified fine jewelry versus costume jewelry. The stupidity was not examining jewelry before bidding thousands, paying $4,500 for $50 worth of costume jewelry, and getting penalized trying to write off your loss. 9. Someone bought a tool collection from contractor for $5,000 that contained nothing but broken, rusty, unusable tools from the 1970s. The auction showed photos of toolboxes and bags full of tools from an estate sale. The listing said contractor's lifetime tool collection. The buyer assumed they were getting professional-grade tools. Upon delivery, every tool was broken, rusted, or completely worn out. Wrenches with stripped heads, screwdrivers with broken handles, power tools that had been disassembled for parts, rusty saws with missing teeth. A tool expert examined them and said they were all beyond use or repair. The scrap metal value was approximately $75. The buyer had paid $5,000 for $75 in scrap metal. They tried selling them at flea markets as vintage tools. Nobody bought them. They listed them online, no interest. They took them to scrap yards. Scrap payment was $80. Total loss was $4,920. The auction house pointed out lifetime collection just meant collected over a lifetime, not that they were in lifetime condition. The buyer should have inspected before bidding. The stupidity was paying $5,000 for photos of toolboxes without checking the tools worked, assuming old tools were valuable, and losing nearly $5,000 on rusty garage junk. 10. A bidder paid $8,000 for restaurant equipment lot that was broken kitchen equipment that didn't work and couldn't be repaired. The auction advertised commercial kitchen equipment from closed restaurant, full lot, with photos of industrial ovens, refrigerators, and prep stations. The buyer was opening a restaurant and thought they'd save money buying used equipment. After winning the bid at $8,000, they discovered nothing worked. The ovens didn't heat. The refrigerators didn't cool. The equipment was old, outdated, and beyond repair. Repair technicians said replacement parts weren't manufactured anymore. The equipment would need to be replaced entirely. Comparable working equipment would cost $20,000 new. The broken equipment was worthless except as scrap metal. Scrapping it paid $300. Disposal cost $500 because of refrigerant removal requirements. Net value was negative $200. They'd paid $8,000 for equipment worth negative value. They sued the auction house. The case was dismissed because sold as is was clearly stated. They had to buy new equipment anyway. Total cost was $28,000 when they could have bought new for $20,000 from the start. The stupidity was buying equipment without testing if it worked, paying $8,000 for broken appliances, and spending more total than buying new by trying to save money. 11. Someone won a book collection for $3,500 that turned out to be 5,000 water-damaged books from a basement flood. The auction listed extensive book collection, thousands of volumes, estate sale with photos of shelves full of books. The buyer collected rare books and assumed they'd found valuable first editions. Upon delivery, every book was destroyed by water damage. Pages stuck together, covers warped and moldy. The smell was unbearable. Book experts said nothing was salvageable. The books needed to be disposed of as contaminated waste. Disposal cost $700 due to the mold and weight. They'd paid $3,500 for moldy garbage that cost $700 to throw away. Total loss was $4,200. They tried drying some books hoping to salvage them. The mold spread in their house. Mold remediation cost $3,000. Insurance didn't cover it. Total disaster exceeded $7,200. The auction house's listing photos were taken before flood damage worsened. They claimed the current condition was implied by estate sale. The stupidity was buying books without inspecting their condition, paying $3,500 for moldy trash, and creating a $7,000 mold problem in your home. 12. A buyer paid $6,500 for a musical instrument lot that was 30 broken instruments that couldn't be played or repaired. The auction advertised school music program liquidation, 30 instruments, with photos of instrument cases stacked in a room. The buyer owned a music store and thought they'd resell the instruments. Upon opening the cases, every instrument was severely damaged. Brass instruments dented beyond repair, woodwinds with cracked bodies, string instruments with broken necks. A music repair technician said nothing could be salvaged. Repair costs would exceed replacement costs. The instruments were worth approximately $200 as scrap metal for parts. They'd paid $6,500 for $200 in parts. They tried selling them for parts online, minimal interest. They eventually sold everything for $250 total. Loss exceeded $6,200. The auction house said liquidation implied the school was getting rid of equipment, not that it was functional. The stupidity was buying instruments without inspecting them, paying $6,500 for broken band equipment, and losing over $6,000 on instruments that couldn't play a single note. 13. Someone bought a sports memorabilia collection for $9,000 that was entirely fake autographs and counterfeit items. The auction showed photos of signed jerseys, baseballs, and photos from a lifelong collector. The buyer specialized in sports memorabilia and thought they'd found authentic pieces. After winning, they had everything authenticated professionally. Every single autograph was fake. The items were cheap reproductions sold on counterfeit websites. Total authentic value was $0. They'd paid $9,000 for worthless fakes. They reported it to police as fraud. The investigation found the original owner had been scammed themselves years ago and genuinely believed the items were real. No criminal charges were filed. The auction house had sold them as is, without authentication guarantees. The buyer tried selling them as replica items. Nobody wanted them even for free. They tried displaying them as examples of fakes for educational purposes. Insurance wouldn't cover fake items. They burned them in frustration. Total loss was $9,000 for items they eventually burned. The stupidity was buying memorabilia without authentication, paying $9,000 for fakes, and having to burn your purchase because it was so worthless. 14. A bidder won a vintage clothing lot for $4,000 that was 500 pounds of moth-eaten, stained, damaged clothing from the 1950s-80s. The auction advertised vintage fashion collection, decades of style with photos of clothing racks. The buyer owned a vintage boutique and bid aggressively. Upon receiving the lot, every piece was destroyed. Moth holes throughout, permanent stains, torn seams, missing buttons, rotting fabric. A textile expert said nothing was wearable or salvageable, even for parts. The only value was as rags. Textile recycling centers paid by weight. They received $50 for 500 pounds of fabric rags. They'd paid $4,000 for $50 worth of rags. Storage before disposal cost $300. Total loss was $4,250. They sued the auction house claiming misrepresentation. The defense was photos showed vintage clothing, never promised it was wearable. Case dismissed. The stupidity was buying clothing without examining condition, paying $4,000 for moth-eaten rags, and losing over $4,000 on clothes fit only for the garbage. 15. Someone paid $7,000 for an antique furniture piece described as rare Victorian dresser that was a 1980s reproduction worth $200. The auction photos showed an ornate dresser with carved details. The description said, Victorian-era styling, ornate details, estate piece. The buyer collected antiques and bid against other collectors. After winning, they had it appraised for insurance. The appraiser laughed and explained it was a mass-produced reproduction from the 1980s made to look Victorian. Similar pieces sold at furniture stores for $200, $300. The buyer had paid $7,000 for a $200 dresser. They tried reselling it. Buyers recognized it as a reproduction immediately. Best offer was $150. They eventually sold it for $175. Loss exceeded $6,800. The auction house's defense was Victorian-era styling meant styled like the Victorian era, not from that era. The buyer sued and lost. Court said they should have verified authenticity before bidding. The stupidity was paying $7,000 without expert authentication, assuming Victorian styling meant authentic Victorian, and losing nearly $7,000 on a reproduction dresser. 16. A buyer won a coin-operated machine lot for $5,500 expecting vintage arcade or vending machines, but received 10 broken gumball machines from the 1990s. The auction listed coin-operated entertainment equipment, 10 units, with photos of machines covered in tarps. The buyer assumed they were getting arcade games or vintage vending machines worth thousands each. Upon delivery, they found 10 cheap plastic gumball machines, the kind seen in grocery store entrances. All were broken with cracked plastic, jammed mechanisms, and missing coin slots. When functional, these machines sold for $30 or $50 each. Broken, they were worthless. Total value was maybe $50 for parts. They'd paid $5,500 for $50 in broken gumball machines. They tried repairing them. Replacement parts cost more than buying new machines. They listed them online for free. Nobody wanted them. Storage cost $150 monthly. After 4 months, they paid $100 to have them hauled to the dump. Total loss exceeded $6,300. The auction house said coin-operated entertainment technically described gumball machines. The stupidity was bidding $5,500 on covered machines you couldn't see, assuming covered items were valuable, and losing over $6,000 on broken gumball machines. 17. Someone bought a fine art collection for $12,000 that was mass-produced prints and posters worth about $100 total. The auction advertised art collection from estate, various artists, framed pieces, showing photos of framed artwork on walls. The buyer owned a gallery and thought they'd found valuable pieces. After receiving the lot, an art expert examined everything and found zero original artwork. Every piece was a mass-produced print or poster bought from home decor stores. The frames were cheap and falling apart. Total value was approximately $100 for 30 pieces. They'd paid $12,000 for decor store prints worth $100. They tried selling them in their gallery. Customers recognized the prints from their own homes. Nothing sold. They tried consignment shops. Shops rejected them as too common. They donated them to charity, claiming $12,000 value. The IRS audited and reduced the deduction to actual value of $100. They faced penalties and back taxes. Total loss exceeded $13,000 when including penalties. The stupidity was buying art without authentication, paying $12,000 for posters, and getting penalized trying to write off your terrible purchase. 18. A bidder paid $3,800 for a vintage electronics lot that was 40 broken Walkman and cassette players from the 1980s and 90s. The auction described vintage electronics collection, portable music players, collectible with photos of boxes filled with devices. The buyer collected vintage electronics and thought they'd found working Walkmans worth $100 each. Upon opening the boxes, none of the devices worked. Battery compartments were corroded, tape mechanisms were broken, circuit boards were fried. Repair costs would exceed the value of working units. Working vintage Walkmans sold for $20 to $40 each. Broken ones were worthless. They'd paid $3,800 for electronics worth $0. They tried selling them for parts. Parts buyers offered $30 for the entire lot. They eventually accepted $40 after months. Loss exceeded $3,760. The auction house said collectible didn't mean functional or valuable. The stupidity was paying $3,800 without testing if anything worked, assuming old electronics were valuable, and losing nearly $4,000 on broken cassette players nobody wants. 19. Someone won a luxury handbag collection for $8,500 that turned out to be 20 obvious counterfeit designer bags worth nothing. The auction listed designer handbag collection, luxury brands, with photos of bags with recognizable logos. The buyer owned a consignment shop and thought they'd resell authentic bags. An authentication service examined the bags and immediately identified all 20 as cheap counterfeits. The stitching was wrong, materials were fake leather, logos were slightly off, serial numbers were fake. Selling counterfeit goods is illegal. The bags had zero legal value. Disposal was recommended. They'd paid $8,500 for illegal counterfeit items worth nothing. They reported it to police. Investigation found the original owner had purchased them as fakes knowingly, but the auction house had listed them without verifying authenticity. No charges were filed. The buyer sued the auction house. Settlement gave them $2,000 back, still a $6,500 loss, or dollars. They destroyed the counterfeit bags. The stupidity was buying designer items without authentication, paying $8,500 for obvious fakes, and losing $6,500 even after suing. 20. A buyer paid $6,000 for a vintage toy collection that was common mass-produced toys from the 1990s, 2000s, worth maybe $200. The auction advertised toy collection from childhood, various brands, nostalgic items, with photos of boxes filled with action figures and toys. The buyer collected vintage toys and assumed older toys meant valuable collectibles. Upon receiving the collection, every toy was a common mass-produced item from recent decades. Nothing rare, nothing valuable, nothing collectible. Similar toys sold at thrift stores for $1 to $2 each. The entire collection's resale value was approximately $200. They'd paid $6,000 for $200 in common toys. They tried selling them online. No interest at reasonable prices. They took them to toy shows. Dealers laughed at the common items. They eventually sold everything for $180 at a garage sale. Loss exceeded $5,800. The auction house said nostalgic and vintage were subjective terms. The stupidity was paying $6,000 for photos of toy boxes without researching values, assuming old toys were valuable and losing nearly $6,000 on toys worth $200. 21. Someone bought a professional camera equipment lot for $9,500 that was broken cameras and empty camera bags. The auction listed photographer's estate equipment, cameras, lenses, bags, showing photos of camera bags and equipment cases. The buyer was a professional photographer who thought they'd get deals on expensive gear. Upon opening the bags, all the cameras were broken beyond repair. Lenses were cracked or had fungus growth inside. Most cases were empty. The valuable equipment had been removed and sold separately. What remained was worthless, damaged gear. A camera shop offered $100 for usable parts. They'd paid $9,500 for $100 in parts. They tried selling cameras for repair or parts online. Minimal interest. Total sales were $150 over 6 months. Loss exceeded $9,300. The auction house said the listing showed equipment and bags, never guaranteed everything was included or functional. The stupidity was paying $9,500 without inspecting equipment, assuming expensive cases meant expensive contents, and losing over $9,000 on broken cameras and empty bags. 22. A bidder won a collectible plate collection for $4,200 that was 100 commemorative plates from shopping networks worth about $50 total. The auction advertised fine collectible plate collection, limited editions, display quality, with photos of plates in display cases. The buyer thought they were getting valuable collector's items. Every plate was a mass-produced, limited edition, commemorative plate sold on shopping networks in the 1980s-90s. These plates were marketed as collectibles but were produced in massive quantities. Despite claims of limited edition, most were made in runs of 100,000 plus pieces. The secondary market value was $0.50, $2 per plate. The entire collection was worth approximately $50 to $200. They'd paid $4,200 for $50 worth of worthless plates. They tried selling them at collectible shows. Dealers explained these plates destroyed the collectible market because everyone bought them thinking they'd be valuable. They listed them online. No buyers. No. They donated them to thrift stores. Thrift stores had shelves full of identical plates nobody bought. Eventually, they threw them away. Total loss was $4,200 for plates they threw in the garbage. The stupidity was buying collectibles without researching market values, paying $4,200 for shopping network plates worth $50, and learning the hard way that marketed collectibles are usually worthless. 23. Someone paid $7,800 for a vintage video game collection that was sports games from 2005 and 2010 worth about $30. The auction listed video game collection, hundreds of titles, vintage gaming, with photos of shelves of games. The buyer collected retro games and thought vintage meant NES, SNES, or PlayStation 1 era valuable games. Upon delivery, the collection was almost entirely sports games from 2005, 2010, Madden, FIFA, NBA games from years ago. These games were worthless because sports games from old years have no value. Nobody wants to play football games from 15 years ago with outdated rosters. The entire collection's value was approximately $30 to $40 at used game stores. They'd paid $7,800 for $30 in old sports games. They tried selling them online. Game collectors said no thanks. They took them to game stores. Stores offered $20 for the whole lot. They eventually sold everything for $25. Loss exceeded $7,650. The auction house claimed 2005 qualified as vintage compared to current year. The stupidity was paying $7,800 without checking what games were included, assuming vintage video games meant valuable, and losing nearly $8,000 on old sports games worth $30. 24. A buyer won a crystal and glassware collection for $5,500 that was broken glass and cheap glassware worth nothing. The auction advertised fine crystal collection, estate pieces, display quality, with photos of glass items and cabinets. The buyer thought they were getting valuable crystal worth thousands. Upon delivery, most pieces were broken. The few intact pieces were cheap glassware from discount stores, not crystal. An appraiser examined them and found 0 pieces of actual crystal. It was all pressed glass worth $1 per piece when new. Broken glass was worthless. Total value was approximately $20 for the few intact cheap glasses. They'd paid $5,500 for $20 in broken discount glassware. They tried gluing broken pieces. The repairs looked terrible and didn't add value. They listed items online as vintage glassware. No interest, they took them to antique stores. Dealers laughed and said it was broken junk. They threw everything away. Total loss was $5,500 for broken glass they threw in the garbage. The stupidity was buying glass without inspecting condition, paying $5,500 for broken cheap glassware, and throwing away your entire $5,500 purchase. 25. Someone bought a workshop equipment lot for $8,000 that was rusty, broken, dangerous tools from the 1960s, 70s. The auction listed complete workshop equipment, professional tools, machinery, showing photos of equipment in a garage. The buyer was setting up a workshop and thought they'd save money buying a complete setup. Upon delivery, every piece of equipment was dangerous. Power tools with frayed electrical cords, machinery with broken safety guards, table saws with wobbling blades, drill presses that wouldn't hold bits. A safety inspector looked at it and said, everything violated current safety codes and should be disposed of immediately. Nothing could legally be used. Scrap value was $150. They'd paid $8,000 for equipment too dangerous to use. Proper disposal cost $400 because of hazardous materials. Net value was negative $250. Total loss was $8,400. They had to buy new equipment anyway. The auction house said professional tools didn't specify they met modern safety standards. The stupidity was buying equipment without safety inspection, paying $8,000 for dangerous, unusable tools, and paying extra to dispose of your deadly purchase. 26. A bidder paid $6,200 for vintage advertising signs that were reproductions from the 2000s worth about $100. The auction showed photos of metal advertising signs for vintage brands like Coca-Cola, Texaco, and other nostalgic companies. The description said vintage advertising, collectible signs, nostalgic brands. The buyer collected authentic vintage signs worth thousands each. After winning, an expert examined them and immediately identified all as modern reproductions. They were made in the 2000s to look old. They were sold at home decor stores for $10 or $20 each. The buyer had 10 reproduction signs worth $100, $200 total. They'd paid $6,200 for $100 in reproductions. They tried selling them honestly as reproductions. Nobody wanted them. They listed them online for $50 total. No buyers. They donated them to a man cave. Total loss was $6,200 for signs they gave away for free. The auction house said vintage advertising described the brands advertised, not the age of the signs. The stupidity was buying collectibles without authentication, paying $6,200 for modern reproductions, and giving away your $6,200 purchase because it was worthless. 27. Someone won a music memorabilia collection for $11,000 that was concert t-shirts and posters from recent tours worth maybe $500. The auction advertised rock music memorabilia, extensive collection, decades of concerts, with photos of framed posters and shirts. The buyer collected authentic music memorabilia and thought they were getting signed items or rare vintage pieces. The collection was entirely recent concert merchandise. T-shirts from 2010's tours, mass-produced posters from recent concerts, generic merchandise anyone could buy at shows. Nothing signed, nothing rare, nothing vintage, nothing valuable. Similar items sold online for $10 to $30 each. Total value was approximately $500 for current resale. They'd paid $11,000 for $500 in recent concert merchandise. They tried selling it to memorabilia collectors. Everyone laughed at the common recent items. They listed everything online. Minimal interest. Over 2 years, they sold maybe $300 worth. Loss exceeded $2,700. The auction house said decades of concerts meant concerts from recent decades, not that items were decades old. The stupidity was paying $11,000 without verifying what you're buying, assuming memorabilia meant rare items, and losing nearly $11,000 on current concert t-shirts. 28. A buyer paid $4,900 for antique clocks that were broken clock cases with no working parts inside. The auction listed antique clock collection, various styles, display pieces, with photos of ornate wooden clocks. The buyer collected working antique clocks worth thousands each. Upon receiving them, every clock was just an empty case. All internal mechanisms had been removed and sold separately. What remained were wooden boxes shaped like clocks with no guts. A clock repair expert said the cases without mechanisms were worth maybe $50 each as decorative items. The buyer had 8 empty clock cases worth $400 total. They'd paid $4,900 for $400 in wooden boxes. They tried buying mechanisms to complete the clocks. Replacement mechanisms cost $500 and $1,000 each, more than buying complete working antique clocks. They sold the cases for $350 total. Loss exceeded $4,550. The auction house said display pieces technically described empty cases used for display. The stupidity was buying clocks without verifying they had mechanisms, paying $4,900 for empty wooden boxes, and losing over $4,500 on gutted clock cases. 29. Someone bought a vintage bicycle collection for $7,000 that was 6 rusty, broken bikes from the 1980s and 90s worth $50. The auction advertised vintage bicycle collection, classic models, collectible bikes, with photos of bicycles in a garage. The buyer collected vintage bikes and assumed they were getting rare models worth thousands. Every bike was a common mass-produced model from the 80s and 90s. All were severely rusted. Chains were frozen, tires were rotted, seats were torn, gears didn't work, brakes were broken. A bike mechanic said repair costs would exceed $500 per bike minimum. Working versions of these common bikes sold for $100, $200 each. Broken, they were worth $50 as scrap metal. They'd paid $7,000 for $50 in rusty bikes. They tried selling them as restoration projects. No interest. They listed them for parts, no buyers. They scrapped them for $60. Loss exceeded $6,940. The auction house said vintage and classic described age, not value or condition. The stupidity was paying $7,000 without inspecting condition, assuming old bikes were valuable, and losing nearly $7,000 on rusty common bicycles. 30. A bidder won a premium wine collection for $9,500 that turned out to be spoiled, vinegared wine stored improperly for decades. The auction listed wine collection from estate, premium vintages, cellar stored, with photos of wine bottles with dusty labels. The buyer was a wine collector who thought they'd found valuable aged wines. A wine expert examined the collection and found every bottle was spoiled. The wine had been stored in a non-climate controlled garage, not a proper cellar. Heat fluctuations ruined the wine. Every bottle had turned to vinegar or spoiled. The corks had failed. Some bottles were leaking. Not a single bottle was drinkable. Proper vintage wines from those years would have been worth thousands. Spoiled wine was worthless. They'd paid $9,500 for undrinkable vinegar. They tried salvaging any bottles. The expert said nothing could be saved. They dumped everything down the drain. Empty bottles sold for $30 total. Loss exceeded $9,400. The auction house said cellar stored was accurate. It was stored in a cellar, just not properly. The stupidity was buying wine without expert examination, paying $9,500 for spoiled vinegar, and pouring your $9,500 down the drain. 31. Someone paid $5,200 for a vintage record collection that was damaged, scratched, unplayable records from the 1970s, 80s. The auction advertised extensive vinyl record collection, thousands of albums, classic music, with photos of record shelves. The buyer owned a record store and thought they'd resell the albums. Every record was severely scratched, warped, or cracked. None were playable. The covers were water damaged and torn. A record expert said the damage made them completely worthless, even for common albums. Rare albums in this condition were worth nothing. The entire collection had zero value. They'd paid $5,200 for unplayable garbage records. They tried selling them as decorative items, no interest. They listed them for free, nobody wanted them. They threw them all away. Total loss was $5,200 for records they threw in the garbage. The auction house said extensive collection described quantity, not condition. The stupidity was buying records without checking condition, paying $5,200 for scratched unplayable albums, and throwing away your entire purchase. 32. A buyer won a collectible doll collection for $6,800 that was mass-produced dolls from the 1990s worth about $200. The auction listed doll collection, porcelain collectibles, limited editions with photos of dolls in boxes. The buyer collected dolls and assumed they were getting valuable collectibles worth hundreds each. Every doll was a mass-produced collectible doll from shopping networks and department stores in the 1990s. These were marketed as limited edition investments but were made in huge quantities. The secondary market was flooded with identical dolls. Current value was $5 to $10 each at most. The collection of 40 dolls was worth approximately $200 to $400. They'd paid $6,800 for $200 in worthless collectible dolls. They tried selling them online. The market was oversaturated. They took them to collectible shows. Dealers said everyone had these dolls and nobody wanted them. They donated them to charity for tax write-off. The IRS audited and limited deduction to actual value of $200. Loss exceeded $6,600. The stupidity was buying marketed collectibles without researching values, paying $6,800 for dolls worth $200, and learning that limited edition doesn't mean valuable. 33. Someone bought a power tool collection for $4,500 that was broken, recalled dangerous tools from various decades. The auction advertised Power Tool Collection, Professional Grade, Complete Workshop, showing photos of toolboxes. The buyer was setting up a workshop and thought they'd save thousands. Upon inspection, every tool was either broken or subject to safety recalls. Many had been recalled by manufacturers for causing fires, injuries, or failures. None had working safety features. A tool expert said using any of them risked serious injury. They were unsafe to use or sell. Disposal of recalled items required special handling costing $300. They'd paid $4,500 for dangerous recalled tools worth negative value. They reported the auction to consumer safety authorities. Investigation found the previous owner had knowingly kept recalled items. The auction house was fined. The buyer got nothing back. Total loss was $4,800 including disposal. They had to buy new tools anyway. The stupidity was buying tools without safety verification, paying $4,500 for recalled dangerous equipment, and paying extra to safely dispose of your purchase. 34. A bidder paid $8,200 for vintage advertising materials that were water-damaged paper and cardboard worth nothing. The auction listed Vintage Advertising Collection, paper ephemera, nostalgic brands, with photos of boxes of materials. The buyer collected vintage advertising and thought they'd found rare posters and signs. Every piece of paper was severely water damaged. Posters were stuck together. Cardboard was warped and moldy. The ink had run, making items illegible. Paper experts said nothing could be restored. The materials were too damaged. They were worthless. They'd paid $8,200 for moldy paper garbage. Disposal cost $200 because of mold. They'd paid $8,400 total for items they had to throw away. They tried suing the auction house. Case dismissed because vintage materials described age, not condition. Photos showed boxes of items, never promised they were intact. Loss was total. The stupidity was buying paper goods without inspecting condition, paying $8,200 for moldy, illegible paper, and paying extra to dispose of garbage. 35. Someone won a vintage clothing and accessories lot for $5,600 that was moth-eaten, mildewed, unusable items from the 1960s, 80s. The auction advertised vintage fashion lot, decades of style, designer pieces, with photos of clothing racks and accessory boxes. The buyer owned a vintage shop and bid aggressively. Upon receiving the lot, every item was destroyed. Clothing had moth holes throughout, making them unwearable. Leather goods were mildewed and rotting. Accessories were broken or tarnished beyond repair. A vintage clothing expert said nothing had any value. The entire lot was garbage. Disposal cost $150. They'd paid $5,600 for clothing they paid to throw away. Total loss was $5,750. They tried reporting it as misrepresentation. The auction house showed the photos accurately depicted old clothing on racks. They never claimed condition. Case dismissed. The stupidity was buying clothing without condition inspection, paying $5,600 for moth-eaten garbage, and paying extra to dispose of worthless clothes. 36. A buyer paid $7,400 for a gemstone and mineral collection that was polished rocks and glass worth about $100. The auction listed gemstone collection, minerals, display specimens, with photos of colorful rocks in cases. The buyer thought they were getting valuable gems worth thousands. A gemologist examined the collection and found 0 genuine gems. The gemstones were polished common rocks and colored glass. The rare minerals were rock tumbler results anyone could make. Total value was approximately $100 for decorative rocks. They'd paid $7,400 for $100 in polished rocks and glass. They tried selling them as gemstones. Buyers immediately identified them as fake. They tried selling them honestly as decorative rocks. No interest. They used them in their garden as decorative stones. Total loss was $7,400 for rocks now decorating their yard. The auction house said display specimens described their purpose, not their value. The stupidity was buying gems without authentication, paying $7,400 for polished rocks and glass, and using your $7,400 purchase as garden decoration. 37. Someone bought a vintage electronics and radios lot for $6,100 that was broken. Non-functional radios from the 1940s-70s worth $150. The auction advertised vintage radio collection, tube radios, classic electronics, with photos of old radios on shelves. The buyer collected working vintage radios worth hundreds each. None of the radios worked. Many had missing tubes. Wiring was deteriorated. Cases were damaged. Restoration would cost $200 or $500 per radio minimum. Working radios of these models sold for $100 to $200 each. Broken radios were worth $10 to $20 each for parts. The collection's value was approximately $150 for parts. They'd paid $600 for $150 in broken radios. They tried selling them for restoration projects. Minimal interest. They sold everything for $180 after a year. Loss exceeded $5,920. The auction house said vintage radios described age, not functionality. The stupidity was paying $6,100 without testing if anything worked, assuming old radios were valuable and losing nearly $6,000 on broken electronics. 38. A bidder won a collectible card lot for $700 that was common trading cards from the 1990s worth maybe $50. The auction listed trading card collection, sports and entertainment, complete sets, showing photos of card boxes. The buyer collected valuable cards and thought they'd found rare items. Every card was a common mass-produced card from the overproduced 1990s era. The 90s trading card market was destroyed by overproduction. These cards were made in quantities of millions. Current value was $0.01, $0.10 per card for most. A few cards worth $1 each brought total value to approximately $50. They'd paid $4,700 for $50 in common worthless cards. They tried selling them online. The market was flooded with identical cards. They took them to card shows. Dealers said nobody wants 90s commons. They donated them to kids. Kids said they wanted current cards. Eventually, they recycled them. Total loss was $4,700 for cards they recycled. The stupidity was buying cards without researching values, paying $4,700 for worthless 90s commons, and recycling your entire purchase. 39. Someone paid $9,800 for a rare book collection that was book club editions and reprints worth about $300. The auction advertised rare book collection, first editions, collector's library, with photos of leather-bound books on shelves. The buyer collected genuine first editions worth thousands. A rare book dealer examined the collection and found 0 genuine first editions. Every book was either a book club edition, a reprint, or a Reader's Digest condensed version. These were made to look fancy but had no collector value. The entire collection was worth approximately $300 as reading copies. They'd paid $9,800 for $300 in book club editions. They tried selling them as rare books. Dealers immediately identified them as book club editions. They tried selling them as decorative books. Interest was minimal. They sold everything for $280 over a year. Loss exceeded $9,520. The auction house said collector's library described the collection style, not value. First editions referred to some books being first book club edition, not first printing. The stupidity was buying rare books without expert verification, paying $9,800 for worthless book club editions, and losing over $9,500 on fake first editions. 40. A buyer won a photography collection for $5,900 that was random family photos of strangers from the 1960s-90s worth nothing. The auction listed extensive photography collection, decades of images, vintage photos, with sample photos showing old photographs. The buyer thought they were getting valuable vintage photography by known photographers. The collection was literally just someone's family photo albums, random snapshots of strangers' vacations, birthdays, and daily life. No artistic value, no historical significance, just one family's personal photos. Nobody wanted photos of strangers. The collection had zero value. They'd paid $5,900 for worthless family snapshots. They tried selling them as vintage photos. No interest. They tried donating them to historical societies. Societies said they weren't historically relevant. They tried returning them to the family. The family said they donated them because they didn't want them. Eventually, they threw them all away. Total loss was $5,900 for strangers' photos they threw in the garbage. The stupidity was buying photos without knowing what they were, paying $5,900 for one family's unwanted snapshots, and throwing away your entire purchase. 41. Someone bought a vintage toy trains lot for $8,900 that was incomplete. Broken train sets with missing pieces worth $200. The auction advertised vintage toy train collection, multiple sets, classic brands, with photos of train boxes. The buyer collected valuable vintage trains worth thousands for complete sets. Upon opening the boxes, every set was incomplete. Missing engines, missing cars, missing tracks. What was there was broken. Wheels missing, paint chipped, mechanisms broken. A toy train expert said incomplete broken sets were nearly worthless. Complete working sets would be valuable. These were worth approximately $200 for parts. They'd paid $8,900 for $200 in broken, incomplete train sets. They tried buying missing pieces to complete sets. The cost exceeded buying complete sets. They tried selling them for parts, minimal interest. They sold everything for $180. Loss exceeded $8,000 past 20 years. The auction house said multiple sets was accurate. There were multiple sets, just incomplete. The stupidity was paying $8,900 without verifying sets were complete, assuming vintage trains meant valuable and losing nearly $9,000 on broken, incomplete toy trains. 42. A bidder paid $700 for vintage kitchen appliances that were broken, non-functional appliances from the 1950s-70s worth nothing. The auction listed vintage kitchen appliance collection, retro styling, collectible pieces, with photos of colorful old appliances. The buyer thought they'd resell them to collectors or restaurants wanting retro decor. None of the appliances worked. The wiring was dangerous. The motors were seized. Refrigerators didn't cool. Ovens didn't heat. Mixers didn't mix. An appliance repair expert said they were all beyond repair and dangerous to use. As decorative pieces, they were worth maybe $50 each. Total value was approximately $300 for 6 broken appliances. They'd paid $6,700 for $300 in broken, unusable appliances. They tried selling them as retro decor. Minimal interest. They took them to antique stores. Stores said broken appliances don't sell. They eventually sold them for $250 total. Loss exceeded $650. The auction house said collectible pieces and retro styling described their appearance, not functionality. The stupidity was buying appliances without testing them, paying $600 even $700 for broken, dangerous appliances, and losing over $6,000 on vintage junk. 43. Someone won a stamp collection for $7,200 that was common stamps with no collector value worth about $80. The auction advertised extensive stamp collection, international decades of collecting, with photos of stamp albums. The buyer collected valuable rare stamps and thought they'd found a treasure. A philatelist examined the collection and found nothing rare or valuable. Every stamp was a common issue made in large quantities. Most were damaged with tears, creases, or heavy cancellations. The entire collection's value was approximately $80 at face value for postage use. As collectibles, they were worth less. They'd paid $7,200 for $80 in common damaged stamps. They tried selling them to stamp dealers. Dealers said the stamps were too common and damaged. They tried using them for postage. Post offices said many were no longer valid. They donated them to schools. Schools said they had too many stamps already. Eventually, they threw them away. Total loss was $7,200 for stamps they threw in the garbage. The stupidity was buying stamps without expert evaluation, paying $7,200 for $80 in common stamps, and throwing away your entire purchase. 44. A buyer paid $2,500 for an antique furniture suite that was reproduction furniture from the 1980s worth $800. The auction listed antique bedroom suite, complete set, period styling, with photos of an ornate bed, dresser, and nightstands. The buyer collected genuine antiques worth thousands per piece. A furniture appraiser examined the suite and immediately identified it as 1980s reproduction furniture made to look antique. Similar sets sold at furniture stores for $800, $1,200 when new. Current resale value was approximately $500, $800. They'd paid $10,500 for $800 reproduction furniture. They tried selling it as antiques. Buyers recognized it as reproduction immediately. They tried selling it honestly as used furniture. Best offer was $600. They eventually sold it for $650. Loss exceeded $9,850. They sued the auction house. The defense was period styling meant styled after a period, not from that period. Case dismissed. The stupidity was buying antiques without expert authentication, paying $10,500 for 1980s reproduction furniture and losing nearly $10,000 on fake antiques. 45. And finally, someone paid $15,000 for a complete comic book collection at auction that turned out to be water damaged, incomplete comic books worth approximately $200. The auction advertised extensive comic book collection, thousands of issues, superhero titles, complete runs, with photos showing long boxes full of comics and close-ups of recognizable superhero covers. The buyer owned a comic shop and was convinced they'd found a treasure trove of valuable Silver and Bronze Age comics. They bid aggressively against other comic collectors, driving the price to $15,000. When the boxes arrived, they immediately smelled mildew. Every comic was severely water damaged. Pages were stuck together. Covers were stained and warped. The complete runs were missing key issues. A comic grading expert examined them and said the water damage made them virtually worthless, even for reading. Comics that would normally grade at 9.0 or higher were damaged beyond any gradable condition. The few readable comics were common low-value issues from the 1990s speculation era when millions of copies were printed. They tried carefully separating pages to salvage any valuable issues. The paper tore when touched. They identified maybe a dozen readable comics worth $5 to $10 each. Total salvageable value was approximately $200 for the entire collection of thousands of comics. They'd paid $15,000 for $200 in water-damaged comics. They contacted the auction house, immediately claiming misrepresentation. The auction house pointed to the sold as is clause and noted the photos showed comics in boxes. They never claimed the comics were in good condition. The buyer tried selling the damaged comics online as reading copies despite pages being stuck together. Nobody wanted them. They took them to comic conventions where dealers laughed and said, "Water-damaged comics belong in the garbage." They tried donating them to libraries for free. Libraries refused to accept damaged, moldy materials. They attempted to dry them out further, hoping to salvage something. The mold smell persisted. Mold remediation experts told them the comics needed to be disposed of as contaminated materials. Disposal cost $300 because of the mold. They'd spent $15,000 on comics and $300 disposing of them. Their spouse, who'd warned them about buying sight unseen, was not sympathetic. Comic collecting forums shared their story as a cautionary tale about auction fever. They became locally famous as the person who spent $15,000 on moldy comics. Years later, they still occasionally found loose, water-damaged comic pages stuck to items in their garage where they'd temporarily stored the collection before disposal. The smell lingered in their garage for years despite professional cleaning. Their total loss exceeded $1,500 when including disposal costs. The Stupidity was paying $15,000 for comics you couldn't inspect, engaging in a bidding war without seeing the actual condition, assuming extensive collection meant valuable collection, ignoring the mildew smell upon delivery, spending more trying to salvage them, paying for professional disposal of moldy paper, and becoming infamous in comic collecting communities for having auction fever so severe you spent $15,000 on water-damaged comics, worth $200 that you eventually paid to throw away while the smell permanently damaged your garage and your reputation. So there you have it. Proof that auction fever turns rational people into gamblers who'll bid thousands on mystery boxes they hope contain treasure but actually contain trash. The lesson? If you can't inspect it, don't bid on it. If it sounds too good to be true, it absolutely is. And if you find yourself in a bidding war over something covered with a tarp, stop bidding immediately. Your wallet will thank you. Hit subscribe so you never spend $15,000 on moldy comics or $3,000 on broken garden gnomes. And remember, just because someone's auctioning it doesn't mean it's worth buying.